Still staring into the open tin box, I felt the kitchen clock ticking as I realized my daughter-in-law had taken 2 bonds. As my fingers closed around the empty rubber band, I didn't confront anyone, just lowered the lid while the ticking stayed steady. While the clock filled the silence, the smell of cold coffee carried the weight of family trust breaking. The same ticking followed my thoughts as I understood my own son had chosen silence over protecting me. That's when the clock stopped sounding ordinary and started sounding like proof. Still listening, I decided revenge wouldn't be loud, it would be legal, patient, and permanent. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Marilyn's fingers grazed the lid of the old tin box as she reached for the back of the closet shelf. Dust had settled on everything except for the box, which she kept on a small stack of books in the corner. It had been there for years, the silver surface dull with age. She tilted it toward the light streaming through the window, the faint scratches on the tin catching the sun like lines on an old face. She hadn't opened it in months, years, maybe. But today, as the scent of coffee hung in the air, she was compelled to check again. The bonds were stacked neatly inside, wrapped in rubber bands that had long since faded from their original vividness. She smiled at the sight of them, familiar, well-kept, a silent testament to a life lived with cautious care. There were dates scribbled on each bundle in pencil, the numbers almost faded now but still readable to her. These were the things she had entrusted her future to bonds, safe and predictable. A few notes of the past clung to the folds of the paper checks, a long-forgotten receipt, and a yellowed letter she must have kept for sentimental reasons. She set the box on the kitchen table and opened it further, letting the quiet hum of the house settle around her. She had been thinking about those bonds for days now. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked. The windows rattled with every gust of wind. It was nothing dramatic, just the usual wear and tear. But the thought of dipping into those bonds to fix it, well, that would be something. The front door creaked open. Marilyn's attention shifted to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Sean and Violet had arrived for their usual Sunday coffee. Marilyn closed the tin box and tucked it carefully back into the cupboard where it belonged, almost as if it were a secret that would remain locked away for now. "Mom!" Sean called as he stepped into the kitchen. Violet followed, a quick smile spreading across her face before she slid into a chair at the table, crossing her legs in a practiced motion. Marilyn stood and poured the coffee, the sound of the liquid splashing into the cups, mingling with the light chatter of the room. "Coffee's hot," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "Great, thanks." Sean grabbed a cup, and Violet scooted her chair a little closer to the table, glancing over at the kitchen counter. "Everything okay here, Marilyn?" Sean asked, his tone carrying a polite curiosity. He sat at the table, but his eyes avoided hers, as usual. "I was just going through some old papers," Marilyn replied, taking a seat with her own cup of coffee, the warmth of it feeling nice against her hands. "I found the savings bonds, remember those?" Violet's smile faltered slightly as she looked up from her phone. "Oh, the ones from, what, 30 years ago?" she asked with a dismissive laugh. "Those old savings bonds are worthless, Marilyn. That's like monopoly money." The words stung, sharper than Marilyn expected. She didn't respond right away, her mind briefly flickering back to the times when she and her late husband had saved for their future. Carefully, intentionally, Violet continued, eyes glinting with a mixture of superiority and dismissiveness. "You could be using that money for something more important, don't you think?" Marilyn stayed calm, even though she could feel her pulse quicken, the tension settling in her chest. She glanced at Sean, who sat frozen, his gaze glued to his coffee cup. He hadn't met her eyes once. Aiden, her grandson, shuffled into the room just then, his sneakers scuffing softly against the hardwood floor. He looked between his mother and his grandmother, his brow furrowing slightly. Marilyn saw the discomfort in his eyes as he caught the tail end of Violet's words. "Grandma, are you okay?" Aiden's voice was quiet, genuine. Marilyn's lips twitched into a small smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, reaching across the table to give his hand a light squeeze. "We'll see what the bank says." Aiden didn't look entirely convinced, but he didn't push. He simply nodded and sat down beside her, his gaze never leaving her face. Violet leaned back in her chair, giving a soft chuckle, clearly unfazed. She picked up her coffee and swirled it idly, her eyes flickering over to Marilyn's face one last time. Sean's silence, however, cut through the air like a blade. He didn't speak a word. He didn't apologize or offer any defense. He just stared down into his cup as if it contained all the answers. Marilyn's thoughts began to shift, quick and sharp. She'd lived her life keeping things close, tightly wound, carefully tucked away. She had never been one to show emotion, to let the world see her vulnerabilities. But today, something felt different. The bonds weren't just pieces of paper. They were symbols, markers of trust, and someone had tested that trust. She sipped her coffee, the heat soothing her, but her mind was elsewhere. A soft, lingering feeling of betrayal began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Marilyn? S. hand tightened around the cup. She didn't know how things had come to this, how Sean had let Violet's scorn go unchecked, but she'd be damned if she let this go unnoticed. Her voice was steady when she spoke again. "I'll be taking them to the bank tomorrow. We'll see what they have to say about those worthless bonds, won't we?" The air seemed to thicken after that, and even Violet fell quiet. Marilyn didn't feel the need to say more. She had made her point, but she knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as she sat there in the uneasy silence, she could already feel the beginning of something much larger taking shape. Marilyn's fingers hovered over the tin box again the next morning. The kitchen was quiet, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The bonds, neatly stacked in their familiar bundles, looked just as they had the day before, but something about them seemed off. She ran her fingers across the topmost bundle, counting them by series and year, as she had done countless times in the past. The soft rustle of paper was soothing, a rhythmic sound that grounded her. But then, as she reached for the second bundle, her breath caught. 2 of the bonds from the 1,992nd set were missing. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes darted over the remaining stacks. The gaps were unmistakable, 2 rubber bands, broken and left in place, as if the bonds had been taken out and returned hastily, but without care. The neatness, the order, had been disrupted. Her pulse quickened as her mind flashed back to yesterday's conversation, the laughter, the dismissiveness. Violet's voice still echoed in her mind. Those old savings bonds are worthless. Had Violet really believed that? Or had she known something more? Something Marilyn hadn't understood yet. Marilyn lifted the box from the table, her hands steady, and carried it to the closet. The shelves there were lined with more boxes, papers, and old family keepsakes. She stepped closer, scanning the space carefully. The dust, normally thick and settled in every corner, was disturbed on the shelf where the tin box had sat. A few stray marks on the wood, the faintest indentation, told her what she had already started to suspect. The box had been moved. She knelt down and traced the dust patterns with her finger. The marks weren't just from the box being shifted, they were signs of something more deliberate. Someone had been here, had accessed her things. Someone had been careful, but not careful enough. Marilyn's mind reeled. She replayed the events of the previous Sunday, letting each moment unfurl in slow motion. Violet had lingered near the hallway, just a bit too long, eyes darting from the kitchen table to the closet where the tin box was kept. Sean, of course, had disappeared twice, excusing himself to the bathroom. Twice. Too many times. The pieces were falling into place. She stood up, the tin box still in her hands, and walked back to the kitchen table. There was no need for confrontation, not yet. Marilyn wasn't one to jump to accusations. She wasn't going to show them her suspicion, no, not until she had all the facts. Instead, she opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook, its pages worn with use. She began to write, her pen scratching steadily across the paper. January 5th visitors, Sean and Violet. Took coffee. Box in closet accessible. Violet by hallway. Sean used bathroom twice. She paused and wrote the next line with care. Bonds missing. 2 from 1,992nd set. Rubber bands broken. She didn't stop there. She started another list. Dates, Visitors, what was accessible. Her mind raced with the details of every visit. She could remember the exact way Violet had leaned against the doorway that day. A casual glance toward the hallway, too casual. Marilyn's heart pounded as she wrote down everything she could recall, capturing the smallest of movements. As she closed the notebook, a steady resolve began to settle within her. Marilyn hadn't missed anything. No, she had seen it all. This wasn't a mistake. Not a simple forgetfulness. This was deliberate. Someone had taken what didn't belong to them. The next morning, Marilyn didn't waste any time. She picked up the phone, her fingers pressing the familiar numbers with quiet precision. The phone rang 3 times before the operator picked up. Cleveland Savings and Trust. How can I help you? Good morning. Marilyn's voice was cool, measured. I need to ask about the process for flagging savings bonds. I believe someone may have attempted to redeem bonds of mine without my knowledge. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a soft shuffle of papers. I can assist you with that, ma'am. I'll connect you to the right department. Marilyn's grip on the phone tightened, her pulse steady, but her thoughts sharp. She would not let this go unnoticed. She would not let this slip through the cracks. As she waited for the next call to connect, her mind raced. There was no turning back now. She had begun this, and there would be no quiet exit. She could already feel the tension building, the slow, inevitable unraveling of what had been kept hidden for so long. Marilyn's thoughts turned to Violet and Sean. How long had they been planning this? What did they think they would gain by taking from her? The phone clicked, and a new voice came through. Good morning, ma'am. This is Harold Bennett, bank manager. How may I assist you? Marilyn's lips curled into a small, tight smile. I need to speak with someone about some missing savings bonds. I'd like to make sure they are flagged before anything can be done. And with that, the next step of her plan began. She was no longer just a woman with old bonds and memories. No, she was something else now, a force moving quietly, but with purpose. And nothing, no one, would stand in her way. The downtown branch of Cleveland Savings and Trust stood like a stoic monument, its stone exterior worn by time but still commanding respect. Marilyn walked through the automatic doors with a quiet purpose, the tin box nestled securely inside her purse, a fragile secret that she clutched tightly. The cool air inside the bank felt crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth outside, as if it were all part of a careful, deliberate step she was about to take. Good morning, Mrs. Price. The receptionist greeted as Marilyn stepped into the lobby, her voice polished but distant. Marilyn nodded, her eyes scanning the space until they landed on Harold Bennett. He stood near a private office, his posture formal, his face warm but focused. Marilyn didn't need any introduction. She knew the kind of man Harold was. Old school, no-nonsense, professional. Right this way, Harold said, motioning for her to follow. Marilyn walked behind him into the office, her footsteps soft on the marble floors. The room was quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of paper as Harold set his briefcase on the desk. Marilyn placed her purse gently on the table in front of her, as if the contents inside were far more precious than the weight they seemed to carry. Let's get started, shall we? Harold said as he motioned for her to sit. Marilyn settled into the chair across from him, her fingers instinctively resting on the edge of her purse. Just as Harold reached for the tin box, the door clicked open. Violet stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her expression bored but not unfazed by the scene unfolding before her. Marilyn could feel her eyes on her, the unspoken judgment radiating from her as she leaned casually against the wall. Harold paused for a moment but didn't acknowledge Violet's presence directly. He simply continued to open the tin box, each movement deliberate. Marilyn watched carefully, her breath steady. Violet's voice broke the tension. Honestly, Mom, these are old bonds. You can't seriously be wasting your time on these. Her words dripped with condescension, but Marilyn didn't flinch. She stayed silent, watching Harold, who hadn't looked up yet but was clearly sorting through the bonds with increasing focus. Told you they're nothing, Violet added, her tone dismissive as she crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Marilyn. Harold, still standing, looked down at the bonds, then slowly raised his head, his expression unreadable. He stood still for a moment, as if weighing something in the air, and then his hand paused mid-air, his fingers gently resting on one of the bundles. The room seemed to shift. Marilyn noticed at first the subtle change in Harold's demeanor. His face had lost its neutrality, replaced by something sharper, more alert. He was no longer just a banker going through the motions. Something had caught his attention. "I'll need to double-check a few things," Harold said, his voice tinged with caution. He took a step back, his hand still resting on the bonds, his gaze now fixed. Marilyn felt her pulse quicken. Whatever Harold had just noticed, it was bigger than she had anticipated. "Is there a problem?" Marilyn asked, her voice even but heavy with the weight of the moment. Harold didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a file from the desk, his brow furrowing slightly. The tension in the room thickened as Violet shifted in her seat, a nervous edge creeping into her previously confident posture. Marilyn's stomach clenched. She had just crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The air in the room shifted as Harold picked up one of the bonds, his fingers brushing the paper with an almost reverent touch. He paused, then glanced up at Marilyn, his expression unreadable. Violet, who had been watching with a bemused smile, suddenly went still, her arms uncrossing as the weight of the moment pressed into the room. "These bonds," Harold began slowly, "many of them are EE and I bonds issued during high-interest periods. Some have already matured." Marilyn felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief settle in her chest. She had always known they were valuable, but hearing Harold say it out loud made it feel more real, more tangible. This wasn't just about fixing a roof anymore. This was something much bigger. Harold's words kept echoing in her mind, pulling her further into the moment. "These aren't just worth a few $1,000s, he continued, his voice firm. "This could fund a new roof, yes, but it could also provide a comfortable cushion for your retirement, even help with your grandson's education." Marilyn's breath caught. Her heart picked up pace, but her hands remained steady. Violet's earlier mockery was now absent. The smirk that had been plastered across her face moments before had vanished. She was no longer just an onlooker. Now, she was calculating. Marilyn could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in Violet's demeanor. The wheels were turning in her head, and Marilyn knew exactly what she was thinking. How could I get a piece of this? Violet's voice broke through the tension. "So, it's worth more than you thought, huh?" she said, though her tone was less flippant now, edged with something sharper. Marilyn remained silent, watching Harold continue to examine the bonds with meticulous care. She wasn't going to give Violet the satisfaction of a response. She wasn't about to let her in on this moment, not yet. "I'll need to ask you a few questions," Harold said, his focus now entirely on the bonds in front of him. "Have any of these bonds gone missing? Redemption patterns matter." Marilyn's mind immediately went to the missing bonds, the two she had discovered gone just the morning before. Her chest tightened as she realized the full weight of what Harold was suggesting. She had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it was still jarring. "Yes," Marilyn said, her voice calm but measured. "Two are gone." At her admission, Harold's posture shifted. The cool professionalism he'd maintained slipped slightly, and a subtle tension filled the air. He paused, looking at Marilyn, then back at the bonds, as if processing the information. For a moment, neither Marilyn nor Violet spoke, the room heavy with expectation. Harold stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Please wait here," he said, his voice now tinged with a quiet urgency. "I'll need to check something." He walked toward the back office, his steps deliberate, leaving Marilyn and Violet in the sudden stillness. Marilyn's heart pounded as she glanced over at Violet, whose expression had shifted to one of something close to calculation. She was no longer mocking. Now, she was waiting, watching. Harold returned to the room, his steps firm and deliberate. He placed a thin manila folder on the desk, his expression professional but carrying the weight of what was about to unfold. Violet shifted in her seat, her arms uncrossing as the air between them thickened. "Mrs. Price," Harold began, his voice steady, "I've reviewed the redemption attempt." Marilyn's breath hitched, but she didn't show it. She knew it was coming, but hearing it made everything feel more real. Harold flipped open the folder and slid a piece of paper toward her. The words on the transaction note were clear and cold. On January 4th, Harold continued, a redemption attempt was made for 2 of your bonds. It was flagged due to an ID mismatch and signature inconsistency. Marilyn's stomach clenched. She'd known something was off, but seeing it in black and white sent a chill through her. The betrayal wasn't a shock, it was confirmation. She had suspected it all along, but this was the proof. Violet's earlier smugness disappeared, her body language now tense, alert. The attempt, Harold went on, was made at a branch near your son's neighborhood. The ID used didn't match yours, and the signature didn't align with your prior records. The pieces fell into place, sharp and unmistakable. Marilyn's fingers tightened on the desk. This wasn't just a careless mistake. Someone had deliberately tried to steal from her. Violet shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence slipping. I told you, she forgets where she puts things, she said quickly, trying to brush it off, but her voice faltered slightly. Harold's gaze didn't waver from the paper in front of him. That's not what this says, he said firmly, cutting Violet off before she could continue. This isn't a mistake. This was intentional. Violet's face flushed with anger and guilt, but she said nothing. The air between them crackled, the truth hanging like a weight in the room. Marilyn didn't look at her daughter-in-law. She didn't need to. The reality of the situation had already set in. The truth was out. Harold continued. Given the seriousness of this attempt, I recommend we escalate this to our fraud department. I can help you file a formal report, Mrs. Price. It's important to document everything. Marilyn nodded slowly, the decision clear in her mind. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Let's do it. Harold placed the necessary forms in front of her, an official statement, a list of recent visitors to her home. Marilyn took the pen, her hand steady as she signed. Each stroke felt like a declaration, a line being drawn in the sand. As she finished, she looked up at Harold. Thank you, she said quietly. Harold gave a small nod, then turned toward Violet, who was now silent, her expression hardening as she processed everything. Marilyn felt a sense of quiet victory, not over Violet, but over the situation. She had taken control. As Harold gathered the papers, Violet's gaze flicked to Marilyn, but there was no mockery in her eyes now. Just something else, something colder. Thank you, Harold, Marilyn said again, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't done yet, but this was a start. The drive home was a blur. The world outside the car window passed by in muted flashes, streets, trees, houses all seeming just a little too distant, like they belonged to someone else. Marilyn's fingers gripped the steering wheel, the tension in her hands mirroring the storm inside her chest. Sean's voice kept replaying in her mind. Mom, why are you doing this? This is too much. Just talk to me. His words pulled at her, but she couldn't give in. Not yet. She had to process it all. The betrayal, the careful deception, and the way everything had unfolded so coldly and precisely. She had suspected it. She had known. But hearing it from Harold, seeing it all laid bare in black and white, was something else entirely. Pulling into the driveway, Marilyn parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It was supposed to be her sanctuary, but now it felt too open, too exposed. The tin box, once a symbol of safety, now felt like a liability. She couldn't trust the house anymore. Without hesitation, she grabbed her purse, walked inside, and retrieved the box from the shelf. It was time to act. She wasn't going to leave it here any longer, not with everything at stake. Marilyn drove straight to the bank. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. Harold was waiting for her when she arrived. He helped her fill out the paperwork, and in no time, the box was sealed away in a safe deposit box. She watched as he documented everything, securing the bonds in a place where no one could touch them again. A small, quiet sense of relief settled in her chest, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Back home, the house felt too quiet. The first thing she did was change the locks, a simple but necessary step. There was no drama in it, just control. A feeling she hadn't had in a long time. No one was getting in again without her knowing. The doorbell camera came next. It wasn't flashy or complicated. She didn't need that. Just something to watch the entrance, to give her one more layer of protection. Control. She installed it, checking the view on her phone. Everything was documented now. Nothing would slip past her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Sean. She didn't answer. The voicemail came in immediately, but she ignored it. Another buzz. Violet. She glanced at the screen. The message cold and empty. We were only trying to help you organize. A bitter laugh rose in her throat. No, they weren't trying to help. This was something else entirely. At school pickup, Aiden slipped her a small note, his handwriting careful and apologetic. I'm sorry. I didn't know. The words hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment, her heart softened. Aiden had no part in this. He was just a child caught between two worlds. She tucked the note into her purse, feeling a quiet ache for him. The only one who still saw her. Marilyn stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence settling around her. She wasn't done, not by a long shot, but this was a start. And the silence? It would keep them sweating. The small room felt even smaller as Marilyn sat across from the bank's fraud specialist. The woman's crisp black blazer contrasted with the piles of files and paperwork on the desk between them. Marilyn's visitor log and bond inventory list were already spread out in front of the specialist, her hands moving slowly, methodically, as she flipped through the pages. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Price, the fraud specialist said, glancing up briefly, her tone businesslike. I've reviewed everything you've provided. Bond theft is unfortunately not uncommon in families. Access is often assumed to be based on trust, which makes it easy for people to exploit it. Marilyn nodded, but stayed silent. The specialist was right, but she wasn't here for platitudes. She was here for one thing: proof. The specialist continued, her eyes flicking back to the papers. You've been thorough, and that's good. We'll cross-check everything you've given us with our systems. The fact that you've maintained such a detailed log helps us trace the timeline. Marilyn's fingers tightened on the edge of the chair. This was just the beginning. The real proof, the kind that couldn't be denied, was coming. The specialist then slid a set of papers in Marilyn's direction. I've also requested samples of your signature from previous banking records. We'll compare these to the signature on the attempted redemption form. Marilyn didn't respond, watching as the woman began to enter data into her computer. Her eyes were sharp, but her movements deliberate. The longer Marilyn waited, the more she could feel the tension in the air, heavy with anticipation. Then, the fraud specialist clicked a button, bringing up surveillance footage. The grainy images flickered to life on the screen. Marilyn leaned forward, narrowing her eyes as a woman in a large coat and sunglasses appeared, standing at the counter at a branch near Sean and Violet's neighborhood. The woman's face was obscured, but the posture was unmistakable. Marilyn's stomach tightened as the figure stood with an unmistakable air of arrogance. Familiar, so familiar. She didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Violet? The fraud specialist clicked to another image, zooming in on the woman's hand, holding the bonds. Marilyn's heart skipped a beat as she saw the signature illegible, inconsistent with her own. But what struck her most was the unmistakable sense of recognition. That's her, Marilyn said, her voice steady but full of quiet fury. The specialist nodded. Based on our internal checks, this is the person who attempted to redeem the bonds. The ID used was flagged, but we believe this is indeed your daughter-in-law. Marilyn's mind raced, but she didn't let the emotion show. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to make sure this never happened again. Marilyn leaned forward slightly, her voice cold but controlled. Can you prevent redemption without me present? The specialist nodded. We can, but only if the account holder has flagged the bonds beforehand. We can set up a system where you're notified immediately if any attempt is made again. Marilyn nodded slowly, her resolve solidifying. Yes, I want that set up immediately. The specialist began taking notes. We'll get this to our fraud department right away. As Marilyn walked out of the office, the weight of the moment didn't feel like victory. It was just the beginning of something much larger. The air in Ruth Callahan's office felt different, cooler, sharper as Marilyn sat across from her estate attorney. The walls of the room were lined with leather-bound books, and the scent of old paper mingled with a quiet sense of urgency. Ruth, calm and methodical, was already reviewing the documents Marilyn had brought. Harold at the bank called ahead. "I've seen the fraud notes," Ruth said, setting the papers aside. "This isn't just about misplaced bonds, Marilyn. This is an attempt at financial exploitation." The words hit Marilyn harder than she expected. She had known it intellectually, but hearing it out loud felt like a weight dropping into her chest. She swallowed hard but stayed silent, letting Ruth continue. "We need to restructure your trust," Ruth said, flipping through her notes. "We'll create a new one airtight. With your family involved, it's imperative we make these updates immediately." Marilyn's pulse quickened. "Remove Sean," she said flatly. "Completely." Ruth nodded, unfazed. "Of course. We'll change the beneficiaries, power of attorney, and medical proxies. Sean will be excluded entirely. This is no longer a matter of trust." Marilyn's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The sting of betrayal was still fresh, but she refused to let it show. "And a no contest clause," Ruth added, setting the pen down. "We'll draft it into the trust, so there's no opportunity for anyone to challenge the estate in the future." Marilyn nodded. This wasn't just about removing Sean. It was about making sure nothing was left to chance. No space for someone to come back and undo her decisions. "We'll also create a separate education fund for Aiden," Ruth continued. "Something protected, overseen by a neutral third party, so no one can touch it." Marilyn's throat tightened. Aiden. The one person who hadn't betrayed her. The one thing she could still protect. Ruth paused, her eyes meeting Marilyn's with quiet understanding. "I recommend we also keep all communication with Sean and Violet in writing from here on. No more face-to-face." Marilyn exhaled sharply. She had already been keeping her distance, but now it was official. She was done playing games. "Let's do it," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "Let's make sure they can't touch anything." Ruth immediately began drafting the necessary documents. Marilyn felt a shift inside herself. This was the moment of no return. The pieces were falling into place, and her future was no longer up for grabs. Marilyn's phone buzzed, interrupting the stillness of the room. She picked it up with a steady hand, recognizing Harold's number. "Mrs. Price," he began, his voice more serious than usual. "I have an update. The fraud department has identified the individual who attempted to redeem your bonds." Marilyn's breath caught, her pulse quickening. "Who was it?" she asked, though she already knew. "It was Violet," Harold said, his words hitting her like a punch to the gut. "She used a fake ID with her own middle name." Marilyn's grip tightened on the phone. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed still sent a shock through her system. Harold continued. "We also have footage from the parking lot camera at the branch Violet's vehicle was seen there." The pieces fell into place, the betrayal sharper now. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. Violet had intentionally tried to steal from her, and now there was proof. "I'll be sending all the documentation to law enforcement," Harold added. "You should file a police report right away. It's important we have everything on record." Marilyn's mouth went dry. "I'll take care of it." Later that day, she walked into the police station, the paperwork in her hand heavy with truth. Sitting across from the officer, she kept her tone even as she recounted the theft attempt. "I'm filing a report for attempted theft and identity misuse," she said. "The fraud department has already linked Violet to the crime." The officer nodded, typing up her statement. "We'll take it from here," he said. "Thanks for the details." Afterward, as Marilyn pulled into her driveway, she saw Sean standing by his car, his posture tense. When he saw her, he moved toward her quickly, his expression conflicted. "Mom," he began, frustration in his voice, "you're ruining everything. You're ruining my marriage." Marilyn felt the sting of his words but didn't let it show. "She tried to ruin my retirement," she said flatly. "That's what this is about, Sean." Before he could respond, Aiden appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red, his face pale. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." Marilyn's heart broke as she pulled him into her arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly. But inside, She knew everything was changing. The silence between them all was louder now, filled with consequences. The courtroom was cold, its sterile walls making the stakes feel even higher. Marilyn sat in her Sunday best, poised but ready, knowing that the battle she had been forced into was about to unfold in front of everyone. Ruth sat beside her, calm and composed, flipping through the necessary paperwork. Across the aisle sat Sean, his posture rigid, his hands fidgeting with nerves. Violet remained silent beside him, her confidence slipping. The judge, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, entered and took his seat. The session began. Marilyn's heart didn't race, she had come prepared. This wasn't about a public spectacle. It was about control. Her control. Mrs. Price, the judge addressed Marilyn, his tone neutral. Your son, Mr. Price, has filed for guardianship, claiming that you are not fit to manage your own affairs. Sean stood up, his voice slightly shaky but full of resolve. Your Honor, my mother has been confused. She's made erratic decisions recently, and I believe she needs help managing her finances. Marilyn felt a knot tighten in her stomach but said nothing. Ruth responded swiftly, placing the competency letter from Marilyn's physician on the table. Your Honor, the competency letter provided by Dr. Goldstein confirms that Mrs. Price is of sound mind and capable of managing her own affairs. Any suggestion that she is confused is simply not supported by medical evidence. Sean flinched but tried to recover, his eyes flicking nervously between Ruth and the judge. I'm just worried about her, that's all. Ruth didn't flinch. What you're worried about, Mr. Price, is not your mother's health. It's the financial consequences of her protecting her own assets. The fraud attempt was not confusion, Your Honor, it was a deliberate act of theft by Violet. The judge glanced between Sean and Violet, who sat unnervingly still. Violet's lips were pressed tight, her silence betraying a crack in her earlier composure. After a tense pause, the judge spoke again, his tone firm. I deny the petition for guardianship. There is no evidence to suggest Mrs. Price is incapable of managing her affairs. I caution you, Mr. Price, about abusing the legal process for personal gain. As the hearing concluded, Marilyn rose, her heart steady but her mind racing. There was no triumph in her only certainty. The battle was far from over, but today, at least, the truth had won. The office felt colder than usual, despite the heat of the summer day pressing in through the closed windows. Marilyn sat at the desk in front of Harold, her pen resting lightly in her hand. She could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the tapping of keys as Harold typed something into his computer. But it all felt distant, muffled. Her eyes stayed focused on the form in front of her, the federal affidavit that would make everything official. Everything had already been set in motion. But this was the final, concrete step. Harold pushed the form across the desk toward her. Here it is, he said, his voice calm. We're filing this with the Treasury. It'll trigger a review, and it should freeze any attempts to redeem those bonds moving forward. Marilyn didn't hesitate. She'd been through this in her mind 100 times, but now, sitting in the quiet of Harold's office, it felt real. Her hands were steady as she picked up the pen. She knew the significance of the moment. The ink on this document would be more than just a formality, it would be the declaration of her resolve. She glanced over the details once more. The serial numbers of the missing bonds, their purchase dates, proof of ownership, all neatly listed. Each number represented something valuable, but each was also a marker of the betrayal that had occurred. Just sign here, Harold said, motioning to the space at the bottom of the page. Marilyn's eyes lingered on the line. She wasn't shaking. Not anymore. That part of her, the part that feared letting go of what she had trusted for so many years, had already been buried. It was a small act, just a signature, but it felt like closing a door behind her, a door she knew she couldn't ever open again. She signed. The motion was deliberate, the signature firm and unyielding. As she placed the pen down, the room seemed quieter than before, as though the finality of the action had silenced everything around her. Harold stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet, locking the completed affidavit away in a folder. When he turned back to face her, there was a slight nod of approval, but no words of reassurance. Marilyn didn't need them. She knew what had to be done. The following days passed in a blur. Marilyn felt as though the world was moving faster around her while she stayed grounded, in the calm that had come with taking control. The notification from the Treasury came a week later. The bonds were frozen. No further redemption attempts could be made. Her assets were protected for now, and there would be no more theft, no more surprises. But the silence that followed, the lack of any further communication from Violet or Sean, was heavier than anything she'd experienced. Sean had tried to reach her, his calls, his texts, his increasingly frantic messages pleading for her to just listen. One of them stood out, sent late in the evening. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I never thought she'd go this far. Please, let's fix this before it destroys everything." Marilyn didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She didn't need his apologies. She needed the truth, and that had already been delivered through official channels. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Sean. "This isn't just about money, Mom. It's about family." Marilyn's fingers hovered over the screen, a flash of doubt creeping in, but she pushed it away. She wasn't falling for it again. Family? This was about control, about keeping what was hers. She locked her phone and set it face down on the table, the silence in the house heavy but oddly comforting. As she walked through the house, she could feel the weight of everything that had happened. Each step felt like she was further distancing herself from the people who had tried to take everything from her. The house was still. The bonds were frozen. The future was hers again. But in the quiet, Marilyn couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of something else, an impending shift that she couldn't quite name. She wasn't done yet. She knew there was more ahead. But for the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her feet. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The house was still when Marilyn sat down at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator her only companion. She looked at the note Aiden had slipped her last week. The simple, "I'm sorry. I didn't know," scrawled in his careful handwriting. It had been her reminder that through all of this, through the deceit, the betrayal, Aiden had remained untouched. A boy who hadn't yet learned to play the same games. He was still innocent, still the one thing she could protect. She called him in, and Aiden came slowly, his eyes cautious as he sat across from her, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "Aiden," Marilyn began, her voice steady but soft. "I need to tell you something important." Aiden didn't speak, but his eyes were wide, waiting, the lines of worry still etched on his young face. "Adults choose their actions," Marilyn continued, her gaze unwavering as she met his eyes. "And when they make the wrong choices, they have to live with the consequences. But you, sweetheart, you don't carry their mistakes. You don't carry their consequences. Do you understand?" Aiden nodded slowly, but she could see the uncertainty in his expression. She knew this wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one he needed to learn. The world wasn't always fair, but he didn't have to shoulder the weight of others' wrongdoings. Not now. Not ever. Marilyn reached for her phone, tapping the screen to pull up the number of the community center. She had already researched their programs, the ones for children who needed support in tough family situations. Aiden deserved someone to talk to, a space where he could work through the confusion. He needed help learning how to navigate the turbulence around him. "We're going to start counseling, Aiden. They'll help you with anything you want to talk about." He didn't respond immediately, but his lips pressed together as if considering the idea. After a beat, he asked softly, "Will it help me understand why Mom and Dad, why they did it?" Marilyn's heart clenched. She didn't have the perfect answer. She couldn't explain Violet or Sean's actions any more than she could explain the inexplicable pain of betrayal. But she had to give him something to hold on to as he grew, something to help him find peace amidst the mess. "It might not make sense now," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "But you don't need to understand everything right away. What matters is that you don't let their mistakes define you." Aiden looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly, the weight in his eyes shifting just a fraction. As the days passed, Marilyn took action. Ruth had already structured visitation boundaries, ensuring that Aiden could see her without parental interference. The last thing she wanted was for Sean or Violet to use him as leverage. She set up a schedule, carefully protecting his time with her, making sure that Aiden had a safe space where he could breathe without their influence. Marilyn also started teaching Aiden the basics of life skills, things she had always assumed he'd pick up naturally, things she had once taken for granted: budgeting, saving, and recognizing manipulation. She knew he would need these skills, especially now. She couldn't shield him forever, but she could give him the tools to protect himself. They sat at the kitchen table, sorting through mock bills and pretend budgets, and for the first time in weeks, Marilyn felt a sense of normalcy, a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Harold quietly expedited the bond reissue process where possible. He'd made sure all the details were in order, submitting the necessary documents to the Treasury, ensuring that no one could make a move without her approval. Every step, every action was methodical, as if the weight of this process was pushing everything forward, slowly but surely. The stolen bonds weren't the only thing being returned to her. They were symbols of the life she was rebuilding, piece by piece. Outside the quiet of her home, though, the ripples of her decisions had begun to spread. Violet's social circle had shifted as rumors of the bank fraud began to surface. Whispers that once lived in the corners of quiet conversations now grew louder, fueled by the details of Violet's attempt. It wouldn't be long before the truth, official and undeniable, would catch up with her, and Marilyn couldn't help but wonder if Violet ever felt the weight of the choices she'd made, the damage they had done. But for now, in the quiet of her home, with Aiden beside her and the future stretching out ahead, Marilyn could breathe. She had taken back control. And as the phone buzzed with a message from Harold confirming the final bond reissues were on track, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something better. The sun had begun to set when Marilyn sat at the polished wooden table, the final version of her revised estate plan spread out in front of her. The weight of the moment settled over her like a cloak, heavy and final. Ruth sat across from her, methodically going through each page one last time, making sure every detail was correct. Harold stood nearby, his quiet presence a reminder of how much this process had changed her life, how far she had come from the woman who once let others control her future. "Everything's in order," Ruth said, her voice steady. "We're ready to proceed." Marilyn's hand hovered over the pen. The reality of what she was about to sign hit her like a gust of wind, sharp and unexpected. The decisions she had made felt so simple on paper, but the consequences would ripple through everything. She wasn't just altering a list of beneficiaries. She was redefining who she was, who had access to her life, and who would carry on her legacy. She glanced at the beneficiary section. Sean, once the heir, the son she had trusted above all, was no longer listed. His name was gone, and in its place was the cold, methodical truth, removed due to attempted redemption and identity misuse. The words burned her chest, but they were necessary. Aiden's name was now at the top of the list, the sole family beneficiary, not just of her estate, but also of a newly structured education and housing fund. It was a decision that felt right, a decision made for his future, untainted by the actions of his parents. Aiden would have everything she could give him, everything he needed to build a life free from the chaos his mother and father had left in their wake. Marilyn's fingers tightened around the pen. She wasn't doing this out of spite or anger. She was doing it out of love. For Aiden, for herself, for the future they would build together. Ruth looked up from her paperwork, meeting Marilyn's eyes with a silent acknowledgement. "There's one more thing, Marilyn," she said. "You've made sure your legacy will be protected, but there's also the matter of something more public. A charitable gift, perhaps?" Marilyn didn't need to think long. "I want to make a donation to a senior financial safety nonprofit," she said, her voice firm. "A place that helps people like me. I don't want anyone to go through what I did. I want this humiliation to turn into prevention." Ruth nodded approvingly, adding the donation to the document. "I'll make sure it's included in the final filing." The pen hovered once more as Marilyn prepared to sign the final page. As the ink touched the paper, the silence in the room grew, heavy with finality. This was it. This was the act that would define the rest of her life. Harold stepped forward, a quiet witness to the process, not as a mere formality but as a safeguard. He watched as Marilyn finished, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She sat back in the chair, exhaling slowly. She had done it. This was the turning point. Everything before this had been chaos, uncertainty. Now, there was clarity, a clear path forward. The past was gone, but the future was hers to shape. As the final documents were filed, Marilyn realized there was no grand moment of triumph. No sudden burst of joy. The work was done. The stakes had been raised. The consequences set in motion. But in the quiet that followed, Marilyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't perfect. She wasn't perfect. But it was hers every decision, every step, every move forward. And as Ruth and Harold left her house that evening, their quiet acknowledgement of her strength still lingering in the air, Marilyn stood by the window, looking out at the darkening world. The bonds were secured, the estate protected, and Aiden's future was set. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marilyn allowed herself a moment of calm. She had taken back control. But as the phone buzzed with a message from Harold confirming the final filings were complete, she knew the battle had only just begun. The doorbell rang with a sharp, insistent tone. Marilyn didn't need to check the caller ID. She already knew. It was Sean. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but the thought of him standing out there, waiting for a conversation that had already been too long delayed, made her move. She opened the door and found him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn, the same tension in his eyes, the same look he'd had when he'd first tried to justify what Violet had done. "I need to talk to you, Mom," Sean said, his voice low, heavy with a kind of exhaustion that spoke of guilt. Marilyn stood still, arms crossed. Her resolve hadn't wavered. Not since the estate plans had been signed, not since the affidavit had been filed. She had moved on, but he hadn't. "I'm not funding your legal mess, Sean," she said flatly, her voice colder than she intended. "And I'm not going to lie to protect you anymore." Sean opened his mouth to argue, but she didn't let him speak. "You knew Violet took those bonds," she continued, her gaze hardening. "You convinced yourself she'd return them, didn't you?" The words hit him, and for a moment, his mouth moved without sound. He wasn't sure how to respond, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Marilyn could see the realization in his eyes, the quiet defeat that flickered across his face. "She's your wife," Marilyn said, her tone unwavering. "But you let her treat me like a fool. I didn't deserve that." Sean swallowed, his throat tight as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I didn't," he started, but he trailed off, his words unraveling before they could be formed. Marilyn took a step forward, her posture unyielding. "The real loss here wasn't money, Sean. It was being treated like a target, like I wasn't worth protecting. I trusted you, and you let someone take what was mine, and you let me believe it was an accident." A long breath escaped him, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own failure. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. Marilyn didn't say anything at first. The apology felt hollow, empty of substance, as if it were just another excuse to avoid facing the consequences. She had heard enough empty words, enough promises of change. Now, it was time for action, for a reality that couldn't be undone. "Ruth already set the terms," Marilyn said, her eyes locking with his. "No contact except through counsel. No pressure on Aiden. You can't use him as a pawn anymore. I won't let you." Sean's expression faltered, the edges of his frustration giving way to something like understanding or perhaps the quiet realization that he had no choice in this anymore. The power had shifted. He could see it in her eyes. "You're right," he muttered after a long pause. "I'll comply. I know I've lost my chance." Marilyn nodded slowly, the tightness in her chest easing just a fraction. "I want Aiden to have a stable routine. He'll stay with me on weekends from now on." The mention of Aiden shifted something in Sean. He looked like he was about to protest but thought better of it, his gaze flicking to the side, avoiding her eyes. He had nothing left to argue with. "I'll make sure he sees you," Marilyn added. But you need to prove you can be trusted again. And that's not something I'm going to make easy. Sean stood there for a long moment. His shoulders slumped under the weight of their conversation. I understand. Marilyn didn't speak again. She didn't need to. There was nothing more to say. She had set the boundaries, and the only thing left was to stick to them. She stepped back into the house, holding the door open. Goodbye, Sean. He lingered at the threshold for a second longer, looking as though he wanted to say something more, but then he walked away, leaving the air thick with the weight of all the unsaid things. The door clicked shut behind him, and Marilyn stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet. When she turned around, Aiden was standing by the stairs, his small face full of uncertainty. She hadn't even heard him approach, but now he was there, the silence between them deeper than ever. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice small. Is he really sorry?" Marilyn knelt down to his level, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "He says he is, sweetheart," she replied. "Her?" Voice steady. "But you don't have to carry that. You're not responsible for him. Not anymore." Aiden nodded, the weight lifting a little from his young shoulders. Marilyn pulled him close, holding him as he buried his face in her chest. The moment felt both fragile and solid at the same time. As they stood there in the quiet of the house, a weight lifted from Marilyn's chest. She was no longer looking back. She had made her peace with the past and with the person she used to be. And with Aiden in her arms, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The living room was quieter than usual, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound that marked the passing of time. Marilyn sat on the couch, her hands resting on her lap, looking at the neat trust binder in front of her. The tin box, once filled with old bonds and memories, had been replaced by something far more substantial, something that no longer felt like a fragile collection of hopes and fears, but a solid foundation for the future. The documents inside were a symbol of her independence, her security. They were proof that she had taken control, that she was no longer just reacting to life, but shaping it herself. Her fingers traced the edge of the binder, but it was a final, quiet acknowledgement of everything she had done. The pain, the betrayal, the constant sense of being in the dark, it was all part of the process. But it had led to this, a secure future. A stable, unshakable future. Marilyn shifted her gaze to the window, watching the light outside begin to fade as dusk settled in. It felt like the end of a long day, the closing of a chapter that had stretched over months, even years. But it wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And as she sat there, she realized that this moment wasn't just about what had been taken from her or what she had fought for. It was about what she had built, what she had reclaimed for herself. The phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. Harold's name flashed on the screen. She picked it up quickly, knowing what he would say. "The fraud case is officially closed," Harold said, his voice steady but with the same quiet respect he'd shown throughout the process. "The protections are still active. No one can touch your assets, Marilyn. It's all in place." Marilyn exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The relief was like a wave washing over her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt light, not the triumphant kind of lightness, but a peaceful one. She hadn't won a battle. She'd simply protected what was hers, ensured that the future she had worked for was secure. "Thank you, Harold," she said quietly, feeling the weight of gratitude in her words. "I appreciate everything." "Of course," he replied. "I'm glad we could make this right. It's been a pleasure working with you." She hung up, the finality of the conversation settling in. As she placed the phone back on the table, she felt a soft presence beside her. Aiden, standing in the doorway, holding something in his hands. He stepped forward, his small face breaking into a tentative smile. "Grandma," he said, his voice full of nervous excitement. "I wanted to show you something." Marilyn looked at the small envelope in his hands, and when he opened it, her heart gave a gentle lurch. A college savings statement. The first real evidence that Aiden's future was already beginning to take shape, even if it was only a small part of it. "I got this today," Aiden said, the relief in his eyes clear. I think I might actually get to go to college. I might really get a chance to do something." Marilyn felt a tear slip down her cheek, though she smiled, brushing it away quickly. She reached for the statement, holding it gently, the weight of it sinking in. It was more than just numbers. It was a future built on trust, on love, on something stronger than the chaos that had once surrounded them. "I'm so proud of you, Aiden," she whispered. She hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of what she had done. The sacrifices she'd made finally began to feel worth it. For the first time, she saw her work paying off, not in the form of wealth, but in something far more valuable: the opportunity to give Aiden a future free of the mistakes of his parents. As they stood there, holding the paper between them, Marilyn felt the quiet certainty that she had done the right thing, that what had been lost was nothing compared to what was gained. A few hours later, Marilyn took a slow walk by the lake, her pace unhurried, the weight of the evening settling into the soles of her shoes. She could hear the soft rustle of the leaves, the gentle ripple of water against the shore, and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. She wasn't finished. The past still lingered, but it no longer controlled her. The future wasn't uncertain anymore. It was hers to shape, one choice at a time. She paused at the edge of the lake, watching the colors of the sunset blend into the water. The air was cool against her skin, and she took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment fill her lungs. My daughter-in-law laughed. "Those old savings bonds are worthless," she murmured to herself, a quiet, almost amused smile pulling at the corners of her lips. But the bank manager stood up when he saw them, and I learned exactly who deserved to stand in my future. As the sky darkened, Marilyn turned and walked back to the house, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it with clarity, with strength, and with the knowledge that she had finally secured the one thing she had fought so hard for: her own peace.